Welcome back to The Brief, and the topic of discussion today is a potential future Conservative government, an outcome that by the polls today and over the last many months looks at a minimum extremely plausible, and which certainly warrants planning for anyone involved in any type of Canadian public affairs. What this government might do, what their policy priorities could be, how they'll communicate, and maybe what we can tell already. And to have this discussion, we have one of the best Conservative minds in the country, a person who's worked directly with the party of the leader, Pierre Poilievre, on these exact questions. I'm joined by Ginny Roth. Welcome to the podcast, Ginny.
It's so nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
Ginny, lots of folks will know you as a lifelong political organizer and activist. Today, you're a partner at Crestview. Formerly, you were the director of communications for Mr. Poilievre's leadership campaign. To start with, but to sort of warm us up for anyone who doesn't know you, give us this 30-second brief on you. Where'd you grow up? How'd you get into politics?
Sure. So I grew up in Toronto, and I had a very non-conservative upbringing, as many in Toronto do. And I think maybe I was a bit of a contrarian, so I started reading about conservative ideas. It was really books that started it for me. And when I went off to university in Halifax, I had really developed an interest in conservative politics, and I joined the Conservative Party there. And Nova Scotia is a great little small environment to get involved in, and I felt like I knew everyone in conservative politics there within a matter of days. And I moved back to Toronto. I worked for the Ontario PCs, and then I got into consulting, and I've been a consultant for almost a decade. I love explaining politics to clients and helping them navigate what can be very rocky terrain.
Great. Well, that's what we're going to do here today as well, is explain politics to our listeners and what they might expect in a future potential Conservative government. Let's start with the most current events news. We're just over a week out as we're recording this from Trump's electoral victory, and we know he'll have a second presidency. What do you think that means for Canadian Conservatives, and in particular, Pierre Poilievre?
It's tough. Canada benefits from sharing a huge border with the U.S. We have access to that market like no one else, but we are much smaller as a market, and so we can't throw our weight around as an equal. We don't have an equal relationship with the U.S., and that will be true regardless of who the president was. But not only that, but Democrats and Republicans and leaders around the world have been moving towards a more protectionist view of trade. Some might call it a mercantilism. I think that's a more of a pejorative description. And honestly, even if we'd had Harris win, and with Biden, the shift towards protectionism, I think, would be true no matter what. Trump is more bullish as a persona. His diplomacy is a little bit less diplomatic, let's just put it that way. But I think conservatives sort of relish that, in part because Canada has, if you're a conservative, I think you probably think, and frankly, many voters think Canada has had weaker leadership, particularly when it comes to tough negotiations. And so you see in the Conservatives, via Pierre Poilievre and his messaging, I think you see, one, a desire to show that they are savvy and well-positioned to negotiate with the future Trump administration, but also that they won't be naive about it. And that in the same way that voters in the U.S. want Trump to stand up for them, voters in Canada want their leadership to stand up for them. And Pierre Poilievre is clearly trying to signal that by saying that he's going to put Canada's interests first and fight for Canada. What that looks like, we can get into. But from a posture perspective, there's going to be a lot of thinking about if the USMCA is reopened and need to renegotiate a North American free trade agreement. What does that look like? How do we put Canada's interests first and preserve access to far and away our biggest market?
I'd like to ask you about how you'd personally sort of rate the probability of USMCA getting majorly reopened. So that, that's what I often call the new NAFTA that was renegotiated under Trump's first presidency. It's up for a review, I guess, in 2026 that could be, in theory, quick or potentially quite exhaustive. What do you think is going to happen?
I think that our best shot is to try to think about and get in the headspace of why is it that Western leaders are growing more protectionist? Well, to give it the best version of that argument, even at the freest moment of free trade, we didn't really have free trade because they were bad actors. One of the biggest market bad actors in China has distorted free trade and has not traded freely. As if you think about dumping steel into North America, and we can talk about why it's dumping and why, whether it's slave labor or highly subsidized industry by government, that's not a fair playing field, right?
Right.
And
people would argue the same is true of electric vehicles today.
That's right. Yeah. And it's not just the U.S. that thinks that. Canada thinks that too. Certainly the public does. So that is what's driving this. I don't think conservatives will call it friendshoring. I don't think they'll adopt the liberal language. But if you can wrap your head around the idea of a freer North American bloc, or even, frankly, putting Mexico aside, a freer Canada-U.S. bloc, and you saw Doug Ford, the Premier of Ontario, gesturing at maybe there's a way to get closer as on the Canada-U.S. side and push out Mexico a little bit. I think that is the headspace that Canadians need to be in, and that conservative leadership, when they think about potentially governing in the future, needs to wrap their heads around. Can we offer anything to the U.S. when it comes to our own markets and the freedom of our own markets and free movement across that border to the benefit of U.S. firms and American consumers? And if we can start to play that game, but also show that we're tough and that we're not willing to compromise on some of the things that are important to us, like access to those markets, and build relationships beyond just the Trump administration, whether it's governors in key states or other leaders, I think we could be well positioned to say, look, you be tough on China. We'll be tough on China too.
Right.
We won't be a backdoor to China, which I think is why you saw Poilievre come out on tariffs on steel and EVs and other products, aluminum as well, to sort of preemptively signal that in negotiation to say, we are willing to be tough like you are with some of these unfair countries, but we're a fair country, so treat us like one.
So then the next logical step would be the other, I think, most concerning sort of policy proposal from a Canadian perspective on the Trump agenda, which would be this musing of across-the-board tariffs. 10% certainly has been talked about. I've even heard 20 and 30%, depending on which rally speech you saw from Trump. Do you think that strategy of saying, you want to be tough with China, we'll be tough with China too, sort of working together with the United States, what's your level of confidence that could work to avoid us getting really whacked with these big tariffs?
Well, Trump's unpredictable, so my level of confidence is low on basically predicting anything about his behavior. However, there are lots of thoughtful people around him. Some of his appointments are encouraging. You look at someone like Marco Rubio for Secretary of State and a couple other key secretary positions. You see him thinking about and talking about business leaders and key commerce and treasury roles. So that's heartening. There are people who are a little bit more predictable maybe in their behavior. And they do all have a protectionist streak because I think they're responding to a political moment and they want to protect American interests. But I think that there is an opportunity to signal that Canada can play ball on that front. For Trump, I think something about his personality, and you see this throughout his whole career, he thinks everything's a negotiation.
Right.
And so when he makes declarations about an across-the-board tariff, I don't think we should be naive about that, but I think it's just the starting point of a negotiation. And I can't imagine it would be coherent for him to treat China and Canada the same way. And I think there's a very strong argument that he shouldn't. So whether that is exemptions on key industries, particularly key industries where we have an advantage, and we can, people talk about critical minerals all the time, where we are a key part of the U.S. supply chain, and the U.S. cannot do what we can do. Where we have real areas. And, being here in Calgary, we know there are industries in Alberta that the U.S. just can't compete with us on and that are really, really integrated. And so if we can have our industry speak up on that, and also our American counterparts, like those people, those firms in our supply chains who rely on us supplying our products at the rate that we want to sell them at without those punitive tariffs, I think there's a lot of room for negotiation.
Yeah, and as you indicated, certainly in Calgary, people would make that, and in Alberta generally would make that exact case about our energy, that many of our energy products, American refineries are tuned to these, they're not easily replaced. And a big tariff on them would probably increase gas prices, which is politically complicated in the States as well. Let's pivot back more squarely to Canadian politics. And at the moment, we're kind of in the middle of what feels like this incredibly extended campaign. But I'd actually like you to cast your mind forward to a potential next Conservative government. What do you think that government's policy priorities would be?
Well, I won't repeat the slogan, but I think people should take Pierre Poilievre seriously when he says he wants to build the homes. Well, axe the tax first. I mean, very clearly, he goes out of his way not only to say he will axe the tax, but that this election will be a carbon tax election. I think by the time at the end of the election, we'll be sick of hearing about how he's going to axe the tax. Although for Canadians who want that kind of relief, I think that it can't come soon enough. So carbon tax for sure. I think that's like first day policy.
Day one.
Day one, exactly. And taxation in general, he's talked about sort of in response to the capital gains debate, capital gains tax debate rather. He's talked about tax reform more generally. And I think he's been wise to suggest that he'll form, I think he's calling it a task force or a panel to investigate tax reform and look at the whole picture and weigh income tax, corporate tax, capital gains tax, and look at where incentives have grown perverse, or I think really importantly, where productivity, competitiveness, and growth are being hampered by tax policy. So that I think will be further down the road. Build the homes is the second part of the slogan. And there's no question that if he forms government and majority government, a big part of the reason for that will be that young people in Canada cannot afford a home.
Right.
He very much sees supply side solutions as the key to that problem, although I think you will see him curtail immigration because the demand side of that ledger is a challenge as well.
Right.
If he can get immigration in line with Harper era strategy and growth rates, which would still be quite a generous immigration policy and quite fine for growth, and then tackle municipal and provincial zoning and other restrictions and development charges that restrict housing. It'll be difficult at the federal level because he only has so many levers he can pull, but I think he wants to use some sticks. There are a lot of transfer payments that go down to provinces and municipalities, and if he can hold those up in exchange for trying to pressure municipalities to
Which he's talked about doing, yeah.
Yeah, he's talked. So that's a second priority. Crime may be less relevant to your members and listeners, but I think actually safe cities do make for stronger talent pools. You tend to attract people better. If you've got a brain drain issue and you're saying, okay, you are a talented young person, and if you stay here, you won't be able to afford a home, and your neighborhood is going to be crime-ridden and disorderly. That's not a very compelling reason for someone to stay in Canada. So
no, and that's a powerful message here in Alberta as well. I've been surprised over the last couple of years as we tour around Alberta and we'll do roundtables with business leaders in various communities, how public safety is a tier 1 business issue in a lot of communities in Alberta. Certainly in Edmonton, in Lethbridge, in Medicine Hat.
Absolutely,
it comes up in places like that.
And if you're a small business, by the way, it can impact your business, right? To have like petty theft and the kind of disorder that's come from just a lower enforcement, a lighter on crime period. And then the final piece of the 4-part slogan is he says, fix the budget. Now, what does fix the budget mean? Good question. He talks a lot about how the size of government is out of control, the role that government plays, the federal government plays. And so I think it's not at all hard to imagine a program review under the Harper government. After the financial crisis, we went through the Deficit Reduction Action Plan, which was a department-by-department, program-by-program review to bring spending in line with reasonable expectations. I think you'll see something very similar. I think every cabinet minister will be told to review everything in their department and come up with lists of what we can do without. It'll be difficult to do that. A lot of the expense of government is personnel and people, which is difficult. But even
that's increased substantially in recent years.
Substantially. When you look at job growth, and you know this, unfortunately, it's rarely in the private sector. There's so much of our job growth in Canada comes from the public sector. So, I mean, even just taking an attrition-based approach to that, I think you could make a lot of gains in a couple of years. So refocusing on the important parts of government and scaling back on some of the programs that aren't crucial to growth and success is important. And then the final point I would just say is, in politics right now, the cost of living crisis is a very impactful set of issues. That's what people care about. I think over time, if we can get costs in line and wages can start to catch up, we'll realize that actually underneath all of that, we have a growth problem.
Right.
Once we sort of make sure the pie is divided up properly, we'll realize we actually have to grow the pie. And I actually think you can see that in some of Pierre Poilievre's messaging, that he's starting to pivot to that growth, productivity, GDP conversation, especially, by the way, if Trump and his team in the U.S. are trying to drive up growth through better productivity. And maybe we'll have to compete with Elon Musk for that. We'll see.
We may have to. Well, I think there was a tour de force, actually, through each of those sort of slogan/policy areas. And I think there's a point in there that I've heard you make before, which is Poilievre sometimes gets criticized for having maybe a lack of depth behind these kind of 3-word slogans. But I think you've indicated there that if you know how to look for it or how to distill it, that there's actually quite a bit more that's been signaled about the actual policy. Do you think that's fair to say?
I think that's totally fair to say. Pierre Poilievre, for anyone who's spent any time with him, he is a bit of a wonk, a real voracious reader, a consumer of information, very sort of data-driven and obsessed with facts and uncovering new facts and fact-based analysis. But he also understands that to be successful in politics, you have to win. And so his hyper-fixation is developing sound policy and then finding ways to communicate that policies in a way that speaks to people where they are and that doesn't sort of condescend to them or, sort of say like, well, it's too sophisticated, you wouldn't understand, so I couldn't possibly. No.
Right.
I think his view actually is if you can't explain a policy in a simple way, maybe you should think about if the policy makes sense.
Right.
Or if it's worth pursuing. And so, yeah, he's a strong communicator. And I think sometimes the strength of his communications means that he's unfairly portrayed as not being heavy on policy. And I just don't think that's true. If people are unclear how he'd act in a key area, if you just look at his first principles, look at what he said on the issue, and look at what's important to his voting coalition or his likely voting coalition, you can kind of triangulate pretty quickly to where he's probably going to end up.
You said for people who have spent time with him as a person, I think that's a unique thing that you have. And there's lots of Canadians who are still getting to know Pierre Poilievre as a person. Tell us just a little bit more about that. What's he like?
So he's a total policy wonk. He really likes to roll up his sleeves and do things himself. When he puts out a compelling video or he makes a compelling point, there's often speculation about like who's the secret wizard behind the scenes who came up with this brilliant. And I always say to people it's him. And it's not to say that he doesn't have really great staff, hardworking staff,
Sure.
thoughtful people around him. And by the way, it also doesn't mean he doesn't seek out advice. And in fact, he will, especially in an area that he has not had the time to put a lot of thought into yet or do his research. He will seek people out and take counsel. He's a leader in the sense that the thinking is his own. It's funny, on the one hand, he's a real sort of family man. People, I think, have seen him with his wife and children. That's a really big part of his life. And he's close with the people he's close with. But I will also say, he's not first and foremost a relationships person in the style of, say, a Brian Mulroney or someone who notoriously, returned every phone call. And,
right. Handwritten notes. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's why you hear him, and I'm sure we'll get into this, talking about how traditional lobbying is probably not going to work for him. If someone calls him and tries to build a relationship, his first point will be, well, what is the argument you're trying to make? And where's the supporting data? Why should I do this? What's the compelling reason here? And who's it going to help? And I think business sometimes struggles with this because business wants their policy interests and the outcomes that they're advocating for to sort of be self-evident. And I think Poilievre's posture, particularly in responding to this populist moment we're in, is, no, please take the next step. Tell me how this doesn't just help your business for your boardroom. Tell me how it helps you either lower prices for consumers, or increase wages for workers, or hire more people. And there's almost always, anyone who works in business knows that's almost always true.
Almost always the knock-on effect.
Why would a business pursue an initiative that didn't do one of those things? But you have to tell that part of the story because of the kind of guy he is.
Distressingly, for some of us who work in business and communications, not all Canadians make that, connection that what's good for business or good for the economy is automatically going to be good for them. Let's go exactly where you were hinting next, which is Mr. Poilievre's signaled that he wants a different kind of relationship with business, particularly big business, and especially with lobbyists. How are you sort of advising people? What do you think that's going to look like?
Sure. So I think it's important to understand where this comes from. And I won't put all the blame on the Trudeau government. The Trudeau government was successful in 2015 and in subsequent years in a global moment that was pretty optimistic. Economies were doing okay. Debt was cheap. I think that's really important, by the way. Debt was cheap.
Right. No, we kept talking about that during the pandemic. How can we afford to do this? People ask. Well, it's because debt's cheap.
Yeah. And it did not seem crazy to a lot of Canadians at the time for CEOs to be flying off to Davos or COP and talking about things that maybe weren't all that relevant to their core business, whether that's impact investing, if you want to put a positive spin on it, ESG, DEI initiatives, all these kind of trendy, frankly, initiatives. And now what we're seeing is, as economies falter, as inflation rose, as people are struggling, all of a sudden those trends and those trendy initiatives are really dropping down the priority list. And they actually are organically dropping down priority lists for businesses. We're seeing this already. Businesses are deprioritizing impact initiatives and trying to sort of focus on the bottom line. But in the midst of this, governments got really, really caught up. And I think what Poilievre would say is Canadian businesses, in wanting to appeal to the federal government and to global trends, prioritized ESG and other initiatives over the interest of their workers and consumers. And they did that in partnership with the government. And ultimately, the relationship with government became about protections and carve-outs and grants and the kinds of subsidies and government policy that actually isn't good for the economy and isn't good for, it doesn't trickle down to and help regular people. And so
government being more deeply integrated in business and a lot of business decisions being influenced by government policy and moves.
That's right. That's right. So I think a lot of this reaction to that comes from a perception by Poilievre that corporate Canada is kind of out of touch with their workers and their consumers. And he is trying to signal very, very clearly. And I think he's overstating it because, frankly, sometimes people don't always hear it. If you try to do that with me, if you try to say, oh, I just need to get in front of you and I can explain why we need this special protection or I can explain why we need this funding, that will not get carriage with me. I'm not interested in that. But if you have an idea for how government can get out of the way, government can enable you to innovate, government can enable you to grow, tell me through your workers, tell me through your consumers, tell me a story about how that will be true, how it will allow you to charge less for your products, how it will allow you to compete more with your competitors, all of those things that make for a more dynamic economy. And I will listen. That's what I want to hear. And so I think he means it quite sincerely. And, for me, I've been a consultant now for a decade, that's just good lobbying. Like, that's just good public affairs.
Right.
The thoughtful public affairs strategy is always about telling stories that are relevant to voters because politicians care what voters think.
Right. It makes complete sense. And, it's sort of as old as time that business leaders always sort of think, well, if I can just sit down and explain the facts,
That's
and,
right.
we can leave the meeting with the decision. And the reality is that's just not how politics works. I think we're being encouraged and we're thinking about this at the Business Council too. How do we make the case that what we're advocating for helps people, helps workers, helps ordinary folks?
That's right.
Back to policy points, there was one slogan that didn't find its way into the four-part slogan, and that's technology, not taxes. And I wanted to ask you about that because I know you've given some thought to this. You've written even about that it might be time for more pragmatic climate and energy and environment policy in Canada. What do you think such a policy would look like?
So the useful way to come at this is this Canada first sort of mentality, right? I think at the peak of this moment of trendiness, where Canada really wanted to be part of the global conversation about climate change. Prime Minister wanted to meet with Greta Thunberg. Like, we can all remember the halcyon days of just a few years ago. There was this view that Canada had to so aggressively reduce its emissions to be part of that conversation, and that it should be willing to aggressively transition its key industries out of their core business in order to do that. And I think Poilievre, even in the days where the Conservatives had a sort of pseudo-carbon tax under Erin O'Toole, I think Poilievre himself and a lot of people in the Conservative Party were just really skeptical about that. I think the view was we're sitting here in Calgary in the heart of this strength area for Canada.
Totally.
We have a major strength, which is the natural resource bounty that we have.
Across the country.
Across the country, absolutely. We have a lot of land, and there's a lot of minerals we could mine, and
trees, and
energy we can extract. So I think Poilievre's view was always, we are a democracy. We have thoughtful stewards in our business leaders. We should supply the world with our natural resources. And artificially hampering that is just a huge mistake. It's bad for Canadian workers. It's bad for the globe, which will energy demand exists. And demand will go to where there is supply. It will go to Putin. It will go to South American dictators. Like, if it's not supplied by Canada, it'll be supplied by them.
Absolutely.
Or by coal from China, or countless other ways that people will seek out that energy. And so, if we could just ship LNG to Europe, we would immediately impact global emissions because we would be supplying cleaner version of natural gas than is already supplied. So there's that.
Absolutely.
As a starting point, right? Now, Canada also has really innovative business leaders and scientists who are developing the technology that will transition us organically to a cleaner energy future. And so the question becomes, how do you unleash that? And there's no question the current Liberal government's interested in unleashing that as well. But I think the first priority for Poilievre is get out of the way. And so what does a tech not taxes policy look like? It's a little bit ill-formed today, I think. But I think it looks like the sort of least version of government intervention. If innovators can be financed to pursue new technologies or develop existing technologies, carbon capture is like a very obvious example of, and Poilievre talks about this, of how industry is innovating to have cleaner energy. As much as industry can do that on their own without government intervention, great. If occasionally you need government for a bit of leverage on the financing side, if you need some tax credits to bridge on a business plan, I think there's probably going to be an openness to that. I think there's probably going to have to be some version of a policy that enables that, but it will be much more hands-off than the approach you see today, which is a lot more, big grants, like the SIF program federally today. And then most importantly, nothing on the punitive side. The idea of capping emissions, which to me is just capping growth, is taking our biggest industry and putting a cap artificially on it.
Capping prosperity, yeah, absolutely.
So I think you'll see all of that fall off very quickly, and he's been very clear about that.
So just to underline one part of that, here in Alberta, carbon capture is seen as a really important part of our energy future. With the Pathways project, it's the world's largest carbon capture project that's been proposed. Do you think that those sorts of projects will be looked favorably upon by a Poilievre government?
I think so. I think he will say, look, I'm not going to approach this the way the Liberals have, which is to say, cut some big deal with the government to sort of artificially subsidize it. But if there's a role for the government to play, either in clearing the way or in catalyzing new initiatives, to me, that has to do with what taxes looks like. It has to look like industry taking the initiative to innovate and move towards a cleaner future while we continue to exploit our natural resources and the wealth that it creates in Canada.
Let's talk about the fiscal picture. How large do you think the fiscal challenge that Pierre Poilievre may face as a potential prime minister will be?
This is understated. Part of the evidence for that is you see it with the current government. Whomever wins, and this was true in the 90s, where you saw Liberal governments having to really tackle debt deficit problems in Canada, whomever wins is going to face a fiscal picture that's sort of like apolitical. It's not apolitical in the sense that the Liberals over the last decade have run up the tab and we're not in a good spot. But that's
the
true.
point holds that whoever forms the next government,
yes.
Yeah.
And I think part of why you saw the capital gains fiasco is because public servants in the Ministry of Finance said to the Minister of Finance, if you don't have either significant savings or significant revenue tools, you will have a bond rating issue. And so they chose they sort of chose the minimal option that was most politically favorable to them, which was a capital gains tax. But I think that was just a sort of state of execution, right? Unfortunately. And I think Canadians have come to understand that they probably need some tough medicine and that part of the reason we have inflation, I would say the biggest reason we have inflation, is because of bad monetary policy and bad fiscal policy. And so monetary policy is coming in line, and now we need to tackle fiscal policy. And that looks like government sort of sticking to its knitting and doing what it does best. There will be interest groups that will squawk about that for sure. But hopefully the Conservatives are able to win a clear enough mandate and a strong enough majority that they can sort of plow forward and make those tough choices that the current government's not been able to.
I want to ask you a bit of a communications nuanced question, which is I think there's this deep muscle memory in the Conservative Party of Canada that when there are rail strikes or port strikes, things that affect farmers, the Conservative Party sides with farmers in Canada. Now we've got a Conservative Party that's certainly trying to side as well with workers and unionized workers. How do you think Poilievre will navigate those dynamics, especially, as a prime minister when the rails are stopped and farmers are mad?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think one of the toughest ones for Conservatives today. There's a lot of opportunity there, but there's also a lot of risk. I mean, if you look at the American election and you look at polling in Canada, there is clearly a political realignment happening. Young people and working class people are all of a sudden voting Conservative and Republican, and older, wealthier people are voting Liberal and Democrat. That is not for my whole lifetime, that has not been the alignment. Right. I grew up thinking that old people vote Conservative and that I was the sort of rarity, right? And that has changed. And those working people are very open to voting Conservative. They are a big part, I think, of the Poilievre coalition today and will probably form a big part of that government. I don't think that the conflict is as deep as some would portray it, in the sense that I don't think those workers view themselves from an identity perspective as first and foremost union members. I think they view themselves as moms and dads and
Canadians,
aspiring homeowners and Canadians and people who can't afford to fill their car with gas or put groceries on the table first and foremost today. But it's also true that many of them are union members and they don't want to vote for Conservatives they perceive to be like union busting type Conservatives, right? And so I think Poilievre's strategic imperative is to say, we're not. We understand the interests of workers. Well, we understand the interest of workers relative to corporate Canada, by the way. We're not the party of Bay Street. We only want businesses to be successful insofar as they generate wealth, and that wealth then serves to employ more people at better wages and be more competitive and offer lower price products for consumers. We want a dynamic economy for that reason. And so we need to signal that. Now, on any one policy issue, like whether you legislate people back to work or not, that's where it starts to get tough.
Right.
Because there are people who, if there's a rail strike, might be workers in another industry, but who are then suffering because they can't get their products to market or they can't access products in market. And in a way, in Canada, almost everyone's a worker. And so you can't put the interest of striking workers over the interest of all other workers. And I think that you'll see that sort of pragmatism and realism from a Conservative government. I like to call Pierre Poilievre a free market realist. He's a free marketer first. Right. He's not idealistic about it. He's practical about sometimes workers run into conflict with one another on these kinds of tough issues. And you have to make a judgment call. You can't have the entire Canadian economy at a standstill because of one collective bargaining negotiation. And so in opposition, I think you can signal those things a little more freely about your interest in working with key groups. When you form government, you have to take on the responsibility of governing for all Canadians. And in a lot of cases, with the types of strikes I think you're talking about, you can't let it go on for too long because it cripples the economy.
This has been fantastic, Ginny. I've only got one more question for you, which is if you fast forward again to that possible future, it's day one of Pierre Poilievre as Prime Minister. What do you think is going to be the single biggest challenge on the table? You know, the friend of mine thing waking up that morning.
So I try to avoid the phrase state capacity because I don't think people know what it means. But I will try to talk about that and explain what I think it means.
Sure.
Which is the ability of the state, of government, to do its job. I think you saw the worst of this in the sort of post-COVID period where we couldn't get people their passports, right? This idea that we have a huge government, bigger than it's ever been, more employees in it than we've ever had, and yet consulting contracts are bigger than they've ever been, which means government is subcontracting work, even though it's bigger than it's ever been. All of these to me are like leading indicators of a government that's just not working. I was just listening to a podcast with Dominic Cummings, who's this notorious Brit who campaigned for Brexit and then worked for Boris Johnson. And he sort of quit the Boris Johnson government because he was so frustrated by how sclerotic and difficult it is to navigate an old school bureaucracy that just can't get things done. And I think that actually is the biggest challenge for Poilievre. He is going to want to move really quickly, make decisions quickly, and I think he will have a lot of intransigent people in the public service, not because they are partisan and trying to stymie his agenda, because there's a culture in the public service, or there can be rather, there are certainly exceptions to this, but there can be a culture of, you know, you don't get fired for hiring IBM, as people used to always say, right? And when you want to do reform and make change, that can be really, really difficult. So whether it's that, whether it's the Senate, which we know is not a conservative majority Senate right now, I think at first they will have to respond to a conservative mandate and not be seen to be stymieing legislation, but that could change in time. Inexperienced cabinet ministers and staff, all of these implementation challenges for a guy who in the opposition leader's office today can really do what he needs to do. He can marshal his resources to get stuff done and be very nimble and move very quickly. A new government will not be able to do that, or rather they should try, and they will try, and it will be very, very difficult to move the tanker that is the federal government. And so that's sort of a boring answer. Like I said, I don't like to use the phrase state capacity, but I really think, but practically speaking, that will be the biggest challenge.
Actually, I think that's a fantastic practical answer. So thank you so much for doing this today, Ginny.
Thanks.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of The Brief, an Alberta Better podcast series. This podcast is a production of the Business Council of Alberta, and you can learn more about us at businesscouncilab.com. We'd also love to connect with you on social media. Hit us up on any of the major social media platforms and check out the latest of our work. And finally, don't forget to subscribe and tell someone else about the show. Your support means the world to us and lets us keep making podcasts. Alberta Better is available on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or wherever else you listen to podcasts. New episodes drop every other Tuesday.